All right, now we're ready to do our programming. So go ahead from your Blackboard account, from the Programming Assignment 2 Chatroom, download the Programming Assignment 2 Chatroom file and uncompress it. And then when you open the ActionScript file, your project will open. And then you should have under your project, you should have 3 ActionScripts source codes under the Chatroom folder. The main source code is basically the main object, and it creates a chat flow function. And once the chat flow function is called, all of the objects will be created. And so you should have a chat flow class, and you should have a chat room class. In the chat flow class, I created the empty shell so that all of your user interfaces and your functionalities are implemented, with the exception of the functionalities for the chat class, and same with the chat room. So as you see, most of these functions that you will be using are empty. So and the functions that you don't fall under the scope of this class, I'll essentially have them as assigned. So for example, the build UI elements function that creates your pop-up background menu, your text boxes, your buttons and everything, they are essentially already here. For example, when we talked about sending a chat message by clicking on the send, you see the send click event handler is created for the mouse click of the send button. And so if you scroll down, you would see, for example, on send click function is already created for you, and you should populate this function with the functionalities. And I will walk through this process with you one step at a time. Okay, so now we are in the main file, main action script. And so let me just go over what's happening here now. So first off, the main file is basically importing the packages of sprite and event that are basically Flash packages, and we create the main function. This is our constructor function here, and the main object will have a chat flow object, and the chat flow object is a type, or variable is a type chat flow, and so we add the chat flow object to our main object. Now next we go to the chat flow object. So what I want to do at this point is to create the functionalities for the chat flow object. So to do so, I've already left the packages, the importing packages from the Electro server here. So we have Electro server, protocols, errors, connection, close event, connection event, message types, login request, login response, error screens from the Electro tank, Electro server 4, and then from our gamebook, from the UI functions, we also import the error screen and the login screen. And then from the Flash display, we have a loader and a movie clip. Movie clip basically creates a window for us, and the loader basically loads the files. And we have the events, URL requests, and URL loaders. Next, we want to create our chat flow object. Chat flow object is a class, and in this chat flow class, we would have to have an Electro server object that we need to create. So we create a private variable, Electro server, to be of the type Electro server, and then we also go ahead and create a chat room variable. So we will have a private variable chat room, and this will be an instance of a chat room class that we have. Okay, so yeah, I had to actually I left some pieces of code here uh, that with our empty shell, the accessing to that piece of code would give you an error. So I rated that or took that piece of code out, and now I'm gonna go back in again and create the an electro server function. So it's going to be a private or an electro server variable. It's going to be a private variable. I'll call it ES, and this is going to be my electro server. And then let's go and create our private variable chat room, and it's going to be an instance of my Chatroom class. Okay, so if you attempt to run this program now, at this stage it should run, instantiate your classes, but since it's an empty project, it basically opens an empty class here. Now next, we would initialize our chat flow object. So to do this, an initialization function has already been written here, and what we will do is that we'll just go ahead and call initialize. So with the initialization, and at each step I'll run to make sure that we won't get any error. So when the initialization function is called, this private initial function, member function for my class variable, is going to be called, and what it does is that it loads into the loader variable the server.xml, and server.xml, if you remember, was the file that was in the bin folder that had my the list of my the IP address and the list of my files. And then I will attach to this loader an event that upon the completion it calls the onFileLoaded, which is going to be the one down here. And this onFileLoaded is essentially a parsing function that when the file loads, it opens up and it reads the IP address from the XML file and puts in the variable IP, and the connection port, it reads it from the XML file and puts it in the port number. And at this stage, I will essentially create the connection for my Electro server. So at the bottom of this connect to Electro server, you would just call on your Electro server object, and you create its connection. And the connection is going to be the IP address, the one that you read from up here from the string from your XML file, and the port. So at this point, a connection IP address and a connection port will be created for your Electro server object. Okay, you would get an error at this point. It's because at this point your connection, your Electro server object is a null object. We haven't created it yet. So let's stop this process and let's go up and from our initialize function, what we will do is that we will go ahead and we'll create our Electro server object. So we create a new Electro server object here, and then we will set its protocols protocol.binary. And we'll set this protocol to binary. So now if I attempt to run this project, the project will run. So the error I got earlier will not be showing up because now my Electro server object is not null. So in the initialize function, you create the loader function, you add the event listener to it. The event listener would basically load the file, the XML file, parse it into the IP string and the port string. And then also you create your new Electro server object and you set its properties as a binary property. And then since now this is created, your file loader function will now create the connections for it. All right. So so now at this stage, our Electro server object is practically set up for us to add its event handlers. At this point, for our cache flow class, we create 3 event listeners for our event handlers for our Electro server. So add event listener. We'll add one event listener for connection event. So we have a message type connection event, and the connection event is going to call the function on connection event, and the scope of the function will be the scope of this class. Now, this onConnection event string that I associated to my class should be exactly the same as the event listener function onConnection event I have down here. Same thing with my login response, and same thing with my connection closed. So what I'm going to do up here then, I'm going to create my other event listener. So I would add an event listener message type of login response, and I would call on login response. And for the scope, I'll choose the object, the entire object with the this keyword. Now, on login response should be exactly the same as my on login response event handler here. Now, for you not to make a mistake actually and mistype the names, I would just go and for the event listener function that I need to create, I just copy it, and then for the next one, I go and add my event listener for the connection closed event. I'll just copy the name of that function, and this way I'll make sure that these functions will be called with the same name. If you make a mistake in the names of these functions in the strings up here, you're going to get an error. Now on login response, my on connection closed, and my on connection event are empty. So if I call my class, if I run and compile and debug my program, I'll still won't see any difference because my functions are empty at this point. So next, what we need to do is we need to go and create our event handlers. Now notice I left some of these functions, essentially I filled them in by the pre-filled values, and I did that because these functions that have contents in them, they are not really the scope of our class. Essentially, for example, this create login screen essentially creates a login screen for you and creates a listener for its button, so that when you type your username in and you click on the submit button, then on login submit button will be called, and there you can write the logic of your program. So we'll get into those things a little bit later. But now we want to go ahead and create our connection attempt. So the first function handler that will be called is going to be our onConnection event function. So when you attempt to run this program, and if your Electro server is on or not, your project will attempt to connect to the Electro server. And if it's successful, you will then move on and create a login screen. If it's not successful, you show an error message. So this is a good example for our seeing our first functionality of our class. So what happens when my Electro server attempts to connect, I'll check on the connection event argument, and I check to see if the E argument basically got accepted. Okay, and if I got accepted, then I perform the logic that is required, and if not, I'll show the error function. Okay, so let's just for now, let's close my Electro server here, and let's show the error function. So I call up the show error, and I'll send a message that your connection attempt failed. Okay, now what happens, this show error is a function that's already created, and I believe it's somewhere down here, show error. So the show error gets a message as a string value. So the string value that I'm passing to it is your connection attempt failed. So down here, it creates a window for me, and it's called alert. And the alert essentially will show my message, which is that string that I passed to it, and also it will have an OK button. And so when I press the OK button, it basically closes that alert screen. So let's see what happens here. If I attempt to run, a window would show up and it says that your connection attempt failed, and if I click OK, it will close the window for me. Okay, so this is basically the first process. Now notice that this error message was out of the scope, so what I'm going to do is I just, instead of changing my variables, I'll just make it smaller. Connection attempt failed, or just connection failed. Okay, great. So now let's start up our Electro server. I'll just wait until the Electro server starts up, and then let's run again. And now I got connected, so I don't get that error message. But still my functionality is empty. So what I need to do at this point is, now that my connection is accepted, I'll basically go ahead and create a login screen so that the users can submit their credentials. Okay, so at this point the create login screen will be called. Now notice the create login screen is a function that creates a login screen, and the login screen will have a login width and a login height, and it will place basically the login screen in the middle of the screen. And then it creates an event listener to its submit button. So if I click on its submit button, then the event listener on click submit would be called. So let's see what happens here. So if I run this program now, since I'm connected, a login screen will be created. The login screen will have a username label on it, a little input button, and a submit button. So if I click my name here and I submit, nothing happens because the function here goes into the login submit screen and login submit event listener, and nothing happens. So in the login submit event listener, when I click the submit button, I need to create a login request and send it to the server so that my user will be logged in, and then I'll just essentially close my screen, my login screen. So to perform this function, I would have to create a login request. So to do that, you basically create a variable and you call it LR for login request, and this is going to be a login request variable. And then you'd populate this login request with the name of the username field from your screen. So the login set username is going to be the screen, which is this login screen that you just created up here, and its value will be username, because your login screen at this point is a screen object from your user interfaces objects, and that login screen will have, as you see here, it will have a username string and a whole bunch of other properties. Okay, so at this point you create your login request and populate it with the name that the user provided, and then you would send it to your Electro server. So your Electro server object, you call the send function, and then you send your login request to it. And so at this point, your login request, which has a username, it will be sent to your to your Electro server, and then you just close the login screen. So let's run this program at this point, and then when you submit, now the user will be, or the username will be sent to your Electro server. So at this point, the event handler for login response will be called upon, because now you sent the login request, so and your server is on and listening, and you listening to your request because you already connected, and so on login response function will be called. Now notice on login response here, this function is empty, your event handler, and that's why nothing happened. So now in this logic for the login response, we would want to create a chat room if the login was successful, and if not, we will want to show an error. So we go and we get the get accepted, and if the process was successful, we would call this create chat room function. And if it wasn't successful, we will show another error. So show error, and at this point I can either send a static text or I can send the reason that the login failed. So get es error dot get description. So with this process, I either accept the user and create the chat room for it, but it's still empty at this point, or if this login was not successful, I show the error message, and I showed you the error function before. So if I attempt to log in, the create chat room function is called, but that's empty. And if I attempt to log in once more, a message shows up and it says username exists. I don't show you an attempt to log in with profanity, but the Electro server also blocks logins that are initiated by usernames which are associated with profanity. So, so at this point, we created our login response function, and so if our login was successful, then we create the chat room. So in the create chat room function, we will create our chat room object, and then we will associate to it the instance of the Electro server, and basically we'll create the object. So to do this, remember we had a chat room instance that we created earlier. We have, for our chat flow class, we have a private variable called chat room. So what we will do here is that we will call that chat room function, and we create a new object of chat room, and then we would also go and populate its value, its Electro server object, with the Electro server object that we already created, and then we call its initialize function, and when it is created, we just add it to our class. And so at this point, when our login is successful, we call the create chat room function, which is a create chat room function down here. We create a chat room. We already have defined the chat room variable. What we will do is we declare it. Essentially, at this point, at this line, we will assign memory to it, and then we put the Electro server object to it. We initialize it, and then we finalize our initialization. So let's log in, and we submit our properties. So the create chat room function is called, and it creates the chat room for us. So the create chat room calls up the initialize function. I'll go into that function later, but now let's see what it contains. At this point, it's an empty function. It doesn't have any functionality, and so everything is just completely empty. It's because it's just an empty shell. But what it does have is it's a chat room that's initialized. Basically, it has all the UI elements or the user interface elements. So you have a label called chat, a label called user, a label called rooms. You have a screen for chat, for users, and for rooms. You have a text box here that is essentially the contents of your chat. You have another text input item here that you can type stuff in. You have two buttons. If you click on send, you want to write the functionalities that it would take this message and would send it. And then you have another button that you can create a chat room with. So if you click on it, another window will open and it has a label called room name. And then you can submit another text here. And when you click on this submit button, it should create a new room and add it to the list of your rooms. And you also have two list items, one for the list of the users that you can click and select from, and one for the list of rooms that you can click and select from. But again, this is empty. So let's see what happens here. So if you go and you call, then you see what happens. You created a chat room object and then you initialized it. So we go to the chat room object. Now we want to write our chat room functionalities. We already taken care of connecting to Electro server and logging in. So now that we are logged in, we essentially have a chatroom class. And again, the chatroom class imports a whole bunch of things. These are for the Electro server, and we already talked about them in a previous video. And then you have your imports for your application, create room screen, pop-up background, and text labels, which are from your user elements. And then you have buttons, lists, text areas, text inputs, and providers, and so forth. So now I'm going to look at the chatroom class. The chatroom class has an Electro server object, and it's of a type of Electro server. So we already created that and assigned it. The chatroom also has a variable called room or underscore room, which is of the type or from the class room. You have UI components, and these UI components come from your UI script files. So you have a user list, which is a list, a room list, which is another list, a history, which is a text area, a message, which is a text input, create room button, and your send button. Okay. So you also have a chat room label, which is a text label, and that chat room label contains the name of the chat room that your users are in. And you have a create room screen, which creates your screen, allows your users to create a screen. That room screen was when you clicked on the create room button and the screen pops up and it says room name, and then you submitted the name of the room, and you created your and then you submit the name of the room to create a new room. The chat room function is basically your constructor. Now remember, we called up the initialize function for our chat room from chat flow. This is the function that we called up. Now this would build your UI elements and join your user to the lobby. So the first time before anything happens, your UI elements will be built, and this function is called once you initialize your function, and the user will join the room lobby. So let's run this, see what happens. See the username, you submit your username, and what's happening is that now the user will join the room lobby. However, the join room function is empty, but the UI element are built. So let's go over our UI elements and see what we have here. So when build UI element is called in your chat room, a background is created from the pop-up background, and its width and height are 428 and 328, and it will be placed at X and Y of 30 and 124, and it's basically your background one. This is for the chat history area up here. And then you create the user list area, which is another background. So the background is essentially an object that's kind of like this blue area here. So you create that. Its X and Y are 493 and 142, which is basically this point. And its width is 260 pixels and its height is 150 pixels. And so that's your user lists. Then the next area is the rooms area, or the rooms list area. So in the rooms list area, you create a pop-up background that starts at 493 and 295, and its width is 260 and its height is 176. And so that creates your room area here. Then you create a label for your history, and this label is essentially up here. So you have a text label, and its name is chat, and you place it at the top, and then you also associate the name of your chat room to the chat room table here. And then you create another label for the user area. That's the one up here. And another label for the rooms. That's the one down here. Next, you create the text area. So for your text area, or your history of the chat, you call it, essentially we created a variable called history, and this will be a new text area here. It will not be editable, so you put editable false. Your x and y are 50 and 181, and its width is 389, and its height is 207. So that's your text area here. Next, you want to create a text input field. So the text input field is the one that at the bottom here. Its name is _message, and its location is at x50 and y400, and its width is 390. And of course, it's editable, so we won't use any other function, any other we want to initialize any other attribute of this object. Then you have a button called send. This is the _send object here, which is a button, and then its name is send. Its x and y are 340 and 430, and it will have an event listener called onSendClick. So when you click on the send button here, the onSendClick function is going to be called, and the onSendClick, I think we put it someplace, somewhere down here, or maybe up here. If not, I will write these functions later on. And finally, you have an onCreateRoom clicked function for create room here. And so it's a button, and its text is called create room. And when you click on it, the create room window should pop up. And of course, it's an empty object. Okay, yeah, on send click functionality is down here, and on create message on should be another one of these functions. We will get to these functions later. So our UI is already created. Now notice that once you create or you call your initialize function, your UI elements are created. And I just minimize this function here so that we could see some more of the text. And then the join room function will be called. So now my next step to create functionalities for my program is to write the program for join room. Join room should have two functionalities. If the user is already in a room, I need to leave that room, and if the user is not in a room, or after the user left the room, then I would have to create a login, a join room request, and attempt to join the room. So to create this functionality, we will go and we will test to see if my user is already in a room. So remember that this chat room had a _room object, and the _room object is the room that your users will be in. So you test to see if this room object is empty. And if it wasn't empty, meaning that your user was already in a room, we would have to basically leave that room. To leave a room, you create a leave room request, which is a type of Electro server leave room request event. So we would create a leave room request that would be of a type of leave room request. So this LRR is my room. This LRR is my leave room request. To do that, I'll just need to associate and set the room ID of my room that I'm attempting to leave. And to do that, that's very simple. I know that my chat room has a room object. I call it up and I get its room ID. Okay, and then I need to also find the zone that my user is in so that I could also assign that. So I look at my room and get its zone ID. Okay, with these steps, I already created my leave room request and I populated its values, which is the room and the zone that my user is attempting to leave. Now, in our example here, we only have one zone. All of our rooms are in that zone. Now, if you wanted to stay in the zone and go to another room from that zone, you could associate that process. So in this case, we would essentially send our request here, our leave room request, to our Electro server. So at this point, my users will leave a room if they're already in. But since this is my first function that I'm creating here, my users are not going to be in any room. So this is not going to be called upon anyway. So now I need to create a join room request or a create room request. You have two ways to join a room, either by create room request or by a join room request. Most of the time, especially for example for this case, when our rooms are persistent, when we create a room request, if the room doesn't exist, the Electro server will create it and then would join the users to it. If the room already exists, then it just goes ahead and joins the users into that room. Now, for my basic join room event, I'll attempt to create a create room request. So I create a CRR file variable, and it will be from a create room request object, and so I will new it create room request. And next, I would have to create assign to this create room request a room name and a zone name. So my zone name, set zone name. I call this chat, and then set room name, and this will be the room name that I pass to the function join room. So see here, I'm calling join room lobby, and this string will get passed through my join room arguments, and I assign that room name. And now all is left is to send to my Electro server my CRR object, or my create room request object. So at this point, when I run this, my users attempt. Something is wrong. Oh yeah, it should be an underscore. That was the name of my object. Okay, so when I run this process, the login window opens up. First, I got connected. Since the Electro server is up and active, the login response is login window shows up. I type the name and I join, and now I'm joined to the room. I don't have any functionality here though, so I won't see really any significant changes. But at this point, I'm already joined to the room. Actually, let me test it. Okay, yeah, the name of the room that I'm joined to is called chat. Okay,